Welcome to, excuse me, welcome to Module 4. In this lecture, as we continue to discuss colonial society and culture from about 1650 up to 1756, here we're going to explore some British and colonial political philosophies on the eve of the American Revolution. So this lecture map, we're going to be talking a lot about British political philosophies, as well as how we see those political philosophies in the colonies. And I want to stress during this time before the revolution, when we talk about the British and British colonies, the colonists still see themselves as British. So that's why we're going to be spending a lot of time with British thought, British political philosophies. The colonists in 1756, if you ask them, they would say, I'm British. So we want to understand that identity. We're also going to be talking about two more widespread transatlantic movements, the public sphere and the Great Awakening. So first, let's dig into 17th and 18th century, that is 1600s and 1700s, British political philosophies. And to us, the British claim by the 17th century to be the freest people on the earth, the freest people in the world. To us, we're going to see an obvious paradox or hypocrisy when we'll say, wait a second, but aren't they increasingly controlling the slave trade in that time period? Don't the British enslave people in the West Indies and in the British colonies? Yes, to us, like I said, we see that as a great paradox, a great hypocrisy. But let's dig in and understand, what did English liberty mean to British people in this time period? And we have a good example in the colonies to try and tease out this paradox, and that's Georgia. So in 1733, a man named James Oglethorpe, here he is. Oh, let me get my laser pointer. There we go. A man named James Oglethorpe received a grant from the king to create the colony of Georgia. And remember that England had that surplus population of British poor that were coming over as indentured servants. Oglethorpe wants to create something different. He wants to create Georgia as a colony for the, quote, deserving poor. Of course, James Oglethorpe gets to decide who is deserving and by what measure they can prove themselves to be deserving. And he says, this isn't going to be the plantations of Virginia and Maryland. This is going to be small farms, family farms, for people to be independent and prosperous. Now, English come over, and increasingly the colonists in Georgia are looking around and they're saying, wait a second, this is great, but we want to be like Virginia. We want to be like Maryland. We want to have bigger estates and become really wealthy, growing not tobacco in Georgia, but rice and later cotton, not yet. So they said, we want to become wealthy and fabulously wealthy like those in Virginia and Maryland. So actually, we want to enslave others to work this land for us. James Oglethorpe, though, had created a body of laws for the colony that included no slavery. This utopia for the poor, as he envisioned it, wouldn't include slavery. He also, of course, because he wants these people to be deserving poor, he outlawed liquor in the colony, I should say, not the state. He outlawed liquor, outlawed slavery. The Georgia colonists rejected this, and they said, James Oglethorpe, you are infringing on our English liberties. English liberties. The plural should give you a sense that for the English in the early 1700s, freedom wasn't yet a universal concept that everyone had. It was a set of specific rights, liberties. And they said, you're infringing on our English liberties. They overthrew James Oglethorpe, recreated the colony as they wanted. And of course, you know what laws they changed: slavery and alcohol. They brought both into the colony. Now, to us, again, we see a hypocrisy there. Wait a second, they're saying their English liberties are the liberty to enslave others. Yes, because Freedom, liberty isn't an inborn human right yet in 1733. It's a specific set of rights that you have, a specific set of liberties. So let's turn back to England and understand, why do the English think themselves the freest people in the world? Who are they comparing themselves to? And what do English liberties look like in the 17th and 18th century? Well, we got to go back a little bit. The conflict between king and parliament stretches all the way back to the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta in 1215, an unpopular and fairly politically weak king, King John, was forced to sign a document that enshrined certain rights and liberties for the English nobility. Now, this is not just for all English people. This is for the English nobility, that they couldn't be taxed without their consent, that they had the right of free speech in Parliament to bring up issues that they wanted to discuss. So this tension between Parliament, the nobility of England, the House of Lords, people with vast estates in England, people with hereditary titles, they had been trying to wrest power from the crown as far back as the Magna Carta in 1215, which we also look at as an antecedent to our own Constitution. Now, in the mid 1600s, this erupted into an English civil war. The English Civil War was between King Charles and Parliament, specifically that House of Lords, those nobles who had vast armies of their own. So the armies of Parliament went to war with the armies of the crown of Charles in England. Eventually, Charles lost. And in 1649, he was beheaded for treason. This is more than 100 years before the French Revolution. We have the British, the English, beheading their king. One person who was in attendance at the execution said a great groan went up from the crowd. Think about it. You think about Ferdinand and Isabella in our first module. The belief was that God had put these people on the throne. The English just cut the head off of Charles, maybe in defiance of God. This is the world turned upside down. What happens is a brief and chaotic parliamentary rule. Eventually, Oliver Cromwell comes to power. He's a Puritan. He cancels Christmas. He sets himself up as a little king. When he dies, his son attempts to take over. Parliament says, nope, we've had enough of this. We're going back to a monarchy. And they invite, and I'm skipping some other stuff in between there, by the way. They invite William and Mary, cousins of Charles I, also each other's cousins. That's not weird that they were married. William and Mary, they invite them. They basically ask William, would you like to invade England? Come on over. Parliament is ready to welcome you and put a crown on you. But before we hand you this crown, will you sign this English Bill of Rights? William and Mary are like, heck yeah, we never thought we were going to be king and queen of England. Let's do it. And it's William and Mary together. That's how they're always described. So William and Mary sign the English Bill of Rights, and that really cements Parliament's rise, that the balance of power in England has now tipped, has more power. Parliament has created a constitution, a government in which the king or queen, we're going to have that later again, the king or queen is constrained. This is a constitutional monarchy. And according to the British, which includes British colonists in the Americas, this makes the British the freest people in the world. So even though slavery is vital to the British Empire, British people by the 18th century believed theirs was the most free and the most advanced nation in the world. They compared themselves to the absolute monarchies of Spain and France, especially. And because of these religious wars and this anti-Catholic sentiment, they also aligned Protestantism with freedom from the British perspective, and they considered papism, that's a rude word for Catholicism, to be part of the, quote, slavery of absolute monarchy. So when British political philosophers are talking about slavery, they don't mean actual enslavement of people. They're talking about absolute monarchies in France and Spain and being under the Pope. That's how the British can simultaneously engage in the enslavement of others, but consider themselves the freest people in the world. All right. When you kill your king, you have to create new political philosophies. When your great chain of being is dismembered, what keeps everyone in line? What keeps everyone good? These new political philosophies coming out of the English Civil War answer that question. How do you create a populace that's going to create a decent society? The political philosophies that emerge, including two sets of political ideas that we call republicanism and liberalism. These are not these are not how we use the words today. Now, you can always look back in the past and see strains of contemporary political thought. Of course, you'll see parts of maybe American conservatism, American liberalism, in different aspects here, but liberalism and republicanism, they are not two opposing or divergent political philosophies. Rather, they are complementary political philosophies that rely on and build on each other. Okay. Republicanism is the idea that participation in public life by economically independent citizens is the basis of liberty. These small r Republicans believed that only citizens who owned property had civic virtue, defined as the willingness to subordinate self-interest to a common public good. So the idea here of small r republicanism is that politics should be run by wealthy people, because only wealthy people can be disinterested. And by that, they mean put aside their own interest for the common good. Now, you might be like, I don't know if history supports that, Dr. Serafine, that wealthy people in power will look out for everyone else and not for themselves. Right, like we can be critical of this idea. But this is the idea of small r republicanism, that the path to a strong citizenry was that people at the top would control politics. Now, think about how that is going to translate in the colonies, though. The idea that it will be embraced by people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, the idea will be that, well, if there's more land available in the Americas, then we could have people that do have some wealth, that do have some land. We're going to have more people in the Americas under small r republicanism than can vote in England. In England, small r republicanism included about 5% of the male population as people who were able to vote. So voting in England is extremely limited, and that extremely limited democratic participation is justified by this small r republicanism, the idea that only people with their own economic can be uncorrupted by politics. Now, liberalism is not the opposite. Liberalism is not in opposition. Republicanism is about your obligations as wealthy people, what you have to do, what service you owe the country. Liberalism is about your rights, how the rights that you have to be protected. Okay, I said that weird. So the core of liberalism is John Locke. He's a leading philosopher of the Enlightenment that we'll talk about in a minute, and his two treatises of government written in 1680, so after the English Civil War. These will become very influential in the 1700s. Now, Locke argues that governments are created through a social contract where equals, here meaning male heads of households, people with some property, equals mutually agreed to surrender part of their natural rights in order to benefit from the rule of law. Locke said, look, everyone's mostly bad. And if your natural rights include the right to try and seize the property of others, Your natural rights are going to lead to some chaos in the world. So you have to agree to give up some of those natural rights, the natural right to go to war with your neighbor. And in exchange for giving up some of those natural rights, what you get is security of your life, liberty, and property. Locke says life, liberty, and property. Jefferson's going to change that in the Declaration of Independence. So this is your protections, what rights you've given up and what protections you have, that the government has no business to interfere with life, liberty, or property. So republicanism and liberalism complement each other. One's about public life and obligation, one's about private home, economic life, and your rights, your protections thereof. All right. Now remember, small r republicanism in England, like 5% of English men can vote. In the colonies, though, that percentage is always higher, and it's going to continue to grow. So in the colonies, you already see wider political participation even before the Revolution. And these assemblies, like the House of Burgesses, they are, and more like the Boston Town Council, Pennsylvania Assembly, these assemblies are allowed to grow in the colonies, these elected bodies, elected representatives. They're growing in the colonies in part as a result of what we call a salutary neglect. What is salutary neglect? England, for most of the 1700s, is too busy worrying about European rivalries, worrying about war with other European countries. They're not enforcing the navigation acts, navigation laws that say the colonists can only sell, that they can only do trade with England. And because they're not being enforced, the colonists are living it up with smuggled black market goods going up and down the eastern seaboard from the West Indies. So they're ignoring the navigation laws. The assemblies are becoming more and more powerful. They're becoming a threat to governors. What else do I want to tell you about salutary neglect? I think that's all. And colonists love it. Colonists love salutary neglect. You might hear, oh, England is neglecting the colonies. The colonists are like, awesome. Yeah, leave us alone. We're doing great over here. We've got our assemblies that we vote for. We've got our cheap sugar that we smuggle from the West Indies. England, you just worry about going to war with France. Definitely. That's what you should be worried about. All right. Now, so far, when we've talked about politics, we're talking about that very limited population that can vote and their obligations to vote and the rights that they have as well. But in this time period, sorry, I'm scrolling here. In this time period, in the colonies and in Europe, political participation outside of traditional polling places and centers of power is also growing. All right, let's talk about the public sphere and American Enlightenment. Historians understand the public sphere as both literal spaces, but also networks creating and disseminating political thought. The public sphere is entwined with the Enlightenment, and it's how historians understand this phenomenal growth of political participation in the 18th century, the 1700s, that is outside of traditional political spaces. So we're going to see people sharing political ideas in coffee shops, taverns, salons, fancy French parties, and via newspapers and the Republic of Letters, which is a massive transatlantic network of men and women sharing ideas via personal letters. Public sphere and the Enlightenment go hand in hand. The public sphere is how the ideas of the Enlightenment are spread and how they're applied to create much more political participation. The Enlightenment is going to dismantle the old great chain of being. It's going to usher in new ideas of liberty as a universal human state. The Enlightenment is going to create a generation of humanists, people who believed in the potential of human knowledge and human creativity. The Enlightenment is full of flawed, imperfect people, of course, people who didn't live out the values that they espoused, but it created these lofty goals, Most of the goals weren't met in its own time, but the Enlightenment created a map for a more egalitarian, tolerant, and curious society that in many ways, that's a map that we're still following. You may know or have read some Enlightenment thinkers, John Locke, Voltaire, Mary Wollstonecraft, Denise Diderot, Olympe de Gauche, or luminaries of the American Enlightenment like Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, or Thomas Paine. If you're not familiar with the European Enlightenment, you may need a little bit more information, and it's really a transatlantic Enlightenment. This is a political philosophy with origins in France, which sought to apply to political and social life the scientific method of investigation and experimentation. Enlightenment thinkers demanded that every human institution, every authority, every tradition needs to be judged by the measure of reason. And this is the heart of humanism, the idea that humans, through the application of reason and intellect, could potentially understand everything, that no mysteries of the universe are closed to us. The Enlightenment thinkers are suspicious of tradition for tradition's sake, and they believe that some hierarchies had to be evaluated rather than simply accepted. Most philosophers were adamantly opposed to slavery, but they were divided on the idea of racial equality, and only a few entertained ideas of gender equality, although they certainly opened the door for others to do so later. The Enlightenment philosophers were critical of the religious wars that had engulfed Europe. They wanted reason and not religious enthusiasm to rule human affairs. Now, many of them were accused of being atheists because of this, but few were. Some of them, like de Holbach and Diderot, were publicly atheists. But even in this crowd, that was still a marginal perspective. Why were they accused of atheism? Because they were very critical of established churches, church doctrine, and church hierarchies. They were critical of established churches, but they weren't atheists. Most of them, including members of the American Enlightenment like Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, and Ben Franklin, were deists. What did deists believe? Deists believe that there is a God, and that God, I'll use a metaphor here, that God is a fabulous watchmaker. And imagine that God has created a perfect pocket watch, intricate, beautiful. And then God closes the pocket watch, sets it down, and leaves to go where? Not our business, who knows? The pocket watch, of course, is the universe. If we can open it and look inside, we can understand its intricacies. And by understanding the watch, by understanding the universe, you can understand God. That's the idea of deism. That God isn't present in our daily lives like the Puritans believed, but we can understand the cosmic spiritual reality if we can understand everything on earth. To study God, study nature. I talked about Ben Franklin. So this idea of humanism also says that people can be better, that people can improve themselves. Ben Franklin never stopped trying to improve himself. He kept a journal about it. Every day he tried to do a better job at temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. And you can see he's judged himself on a sliding scale, and then he gave up. He's like, I'm not doing great at these today, but he never stopped trying. These ideas are spread in the public sphere, and that includes new spaces like the Junto, Junto. The Junto is a philosophical society created by Ben Franklin in Philadelphia. They created a library, especially for young, what we would call working class men, could come and borrow books for a small fee. It's not yet the free public library, but you don't have to go to the Junto to learn about these new political ideas. In America, you can just go to the tavern. Colonists become increasingly political reading these ideas. You don't even have to be literate, although literacy is on the rise, because you can have these ideas read to you. You don't have to be able to read to be able to think. So you can go to the tavern and hear someone read to you these new ideas and debate them and talk about them. The Enlightenment is critical of hierarchy. A lot of people in the hierarchy don't like that. One Philadelphia clergyman said about these people meeting in taverns, he said, the poorest laborer thinks himself entitled to deliver his sentiments in matters of religion or politics with as much freedom as the gentleman or scholar. You could see that he was very aghast. How dare these people come and talk about politics? They can't even vote. What business is it of theirs? Now, these ideas are spread in print. So the Enlightenment, of course, stresses free speech and a free press. Now, the English were very proud of themselves for having a free speech. Here's how free speech worked in England. They didn't have censorship. They're very proud of themselves for not having censorship. We don't censor anything. You can print whatever you want. And then you're going to be found guilty of libel. Which one's written? Is it libel? You're going to be found guilty of libel. So they're like, yeah, print whatever you want. The next day they'll come and shut your printing press down. That happened in 1690. Public Occurrences had one single issue. It was immediately shut down because it criticized military cooperation with the Iroquois. In 1735, in the colonies, this is tested. John Peter Zenger, I couldn't remember his first name. John Peter Zenger is a German-born printer. In 1735, he's creates a newspaper in New York, and he accuses the New York governor of corruption. He was allowed to print this, and then he was immediately arrested for seditious libel. And when he was on trial, the judge said, look, to the jury, the judge says to the jury, look, you know the libel laws. It doesn't have to be false to be seditious libel. It doesn't have to be false. It can be true and still be libel if it's critical of authorities, of British authorities. And he says, look, we have the proof right here. He did it. This is the newspaper. Peter Zenger, is this your newspaper? Yes. The judge is like, all right, jury, go find guilty or not guilty. And the jury of colonists comes back and says, not guilty. And the judge says, what are you talking about? It's right here. He says this is his. This is seditious libel. And they say, yeah, but we liked it. We agree. We also think the governor is corrupt. We're not going to find him guilty of this. Now, if the governor had been popular, this may have gone a different way. The jurists really do like this because they agree. But what we see here is the colonists are redefining free speech far beyond how the English understand it back in England. So this is one of the ways that we're going to see colonists are starting to outgrow these British philosophies. We're going to end with one last movement, and that is the Great Awakening. Now, in many ways, the Great Awakening is the antithesis of the Enlightenment. The Great Awakening is a transatlantic phenomena. It's even a global phenomena. The Protestantism isn't the only religion that's having these Great Awakenings or sort of return to earlier ways of thought. This is happening globally, but in Protestant religion, people are looking around and they're concerned that people are drifting away from the church, that they're more interested in making money, especially in the colonies. They look at the church hierarchy as corrupt, the Church of England. And we have these preachers, these itinerant preachers like George Whitefield, and these local events. This isn't some coordinated mass colonial project. These are local events where we have these highly emotional spiritual church revivals. The Great Awakening stressed individual relationship with God, individual spiritual transformation, and that transformation could be instantaneous. So George Whitefield would be giving a fiery sermon and people would be shouting from the pews, I'm going to hell, what can I do? And come out of that church understanding that they had been saved. Highly emotional. This is a religion of the heart. Now, this is very different in many ways to the Enlightenment, prioritizing heart and emotionalism over reason. But like the Enlightenment, it centered the individual discernment, individual relationships with God, individual salvation. It's skeptical of church hierarchies, and it's pulling in a lot of people that don't feel welcome in established churches. And we even have in the South, we see a rise of enslaved preachers, Black preachers who are enslaved. We even see some women preaching during the Enlightenment. So it's skeptical of church hierarchy, it's skeptical of other hierarchies, and it advocates for a separation of spiritual and political matters, in part here because these Protestant sects are shut out of the official church, which is the Church of England. It says, no, we don't want an official church. We want separation of church and state to protect our faith from corruption, and because we don't want to pay taxes to churches that we don't go to. All right. That's it. That's all I have for you. Look at this. So this image of George Whitefield. And yet people made fun of, like his critics made fun of him for how he looked. It was actually, there was a lot of bullying. But we can see down here that my students always say like, oh, she looks bored. No, she's rapturous. She's experiencing a transformation. And we can see that the artist has told us all kinds of people come to these revivals. We know because we've got a fancy lady, a wealthy man. This is a wig. And then a laborer here, because the artist has depicted him as dirty, very, very unsubtle here. But we have a variety of people being pulled in and into this Great Awakening. We're going to see a second Great Awakening in about 100 years. Americans seem to love a Great Awakening. 1620s with Puritans, 1720s here, 1820s and 30s we'll have another one, 1920s tent revival. So seems like we're due. Keep an eye out for for some sort of revivalism. All right, have a wonderful day, and I will see you in Module 5.